Hi, y'all. So this is our podcast. It's called a melting pot, or is it fondue? Only works with certain types of cheese. Others don't melt as well. So the documentary that the podcast that we had to watch was called School of Colors. It is a documentary podcast that is based in Brooklyn, deep on class, race, and power shape American cities and education. There are conversations with different generations of parents and how it has affected them.
So through these conversations, the audience that it appeals to are parents, educators, political representatives, and advocates.
Season one starts off in Brooklyn. The two gentlemen that started the podcast both grew up or live in Brooklyn, and one is a white Jewish guy and one is a black guy, and talking about their different experiences going or what they saw in the community. And one of they start by talking about Bed-Stuy and District 16 and how it was overcrowded, and it tended to be mostly Black children. But as the years went on, in like the 1960s, and people started to gentrify and move around, there was a big influx of um, the Jewish population in New York moving in there because they were both marginalized communities that were getting pushed around. Um, and they were trying to work on, how to get kids into certain schools. And there's still conflict um, about how like Black and white students feel like they somehow had an educational opportunity taken away from them. And they were a couple of experimental schools that did or didn't work, but they did not stay around in Brooklyn. And I used to live there, and I can tell you that that area still has those same conflicts right now today, trying to figure out where to send their kids to school.
Okay. Um, so in my neighborhood, so I can relate to season five because it talks about 150 schools being closed. And growing up, my neighborhood only had one high school with while a bunch of schools were being closed. So they were promised another high school and they didn't follow through. So then people went on a hunger strike so that school could be built. So that was really relatable to me because then I was able to go into a high school other than the one in my side of the neighborhood, because my neighborhood was divided into two, so it was like the north and the south of the neighborhood. So for me to go to the other school, I had to use somebody else's address, which was my family from the other side of the neighborhood, so I could go in. So that's one of the issues that I was able to relate to in season five, on season one, episode five.
All right, so I have this visual. The grass is greener on the other side, or, is it greener on the other side? And it's perfect as I was thinking about season two, episodes 1 through 3. Episodes 1 through 3. There's a lot of discussion around the north and the south side of Queens, New York. And in one district, and it's District 28. And it was surrounded by the discussions and the conversations, race, class, the school resources, this big diversity plan, but there was no real plan, and relocation of students. And the discussions, as we pointed out from the audience, it was from the parents and those that opposed this plan and opposed the relocation, but also agreed with the plan. And as I was listening to those 3 episodes and even a few more after that, it brought to mind many things for me being a parent and then wanting to see the best for your child, which was what I thought every parent that was advocating for their child, whether they agreed with the plan or disagreed, they all wanted the best for their child. Um, and in my son's school district, there's a noticeably it's noticeably different when I go into my school district, which is only 15 minutes away from each other. But what you notice is like my school district is predominantly Black and Brown students. And then my son's school district is 60% minority. However, 9% of those students are Black. Um, so when I think about diversity and the conversations of school colors around division and segregation, um, with my school only being, well, not only, it's like 80 to 90% Black and Brown. Um, I question, is it really diverse? Is what I potentially feel. We have less resources and it is less diverse. So that visual is just perfect between like the North and the South. Just like, is the grass green on the other side? Because the two is what they were fighting for was the resources that many schools currently lack or
And
have much of.
even within our school district, which Tiffany and I are both at 187, which is a K-12 district. My elementary school is part of the naval base or the naval housing. And there's a huge difference in population between my elementary school and Tiffany's elementary school due to the naval officers. So my elementary school in North Chicago is more diverse. However, they're also transient children. They all get moved once the Navy is done taking them out. So by the time you get to the middle school, it's back to being majority Black and brown.
No, I think definitely like season 2 was like one that really stood out to me. I think kind of going back to like what Tiffany said about, you know, you're talking like the North and the South. I kind of see that within like the CPS. I think even just growing up, you're like, oh, the North side has better resources compared to the South side because they see the South side as like a less thing. It's kind of even like, um when we think about like when Rami Emanuel closed a bunch of the schools on the South side and a lot of teachers were left out of like positions, all these like services were gone. Um, but kind of going back into like, a little bit moving forward with like the podcast. I did like that they talked about episode 8, which was essentially talking about in 2018, the New York City mayor, he kind of was trying to replace this the specialist high school admission test, or known as I'm not even gonna try to say SHSAT. Um, Essentially what it was a test very similar to like, when you're trying to get into like a selective enrollment school here. And what I like about this episode is that it kind of takes away from like, yeah, like we're looking at Latinx and Black people, but it also, we talk about Asian American people who, they talk about like coming to America, and education is like the one thing that they have. So, them having the school test, it's made for them to like kind of achieve a bigger goal, especially with like, their pedagogy of them, coming from being really strict on education. And I'm not a big fan of like standardized tests because I just feel like they're not really, I feel like there's a little bias with them. I feel like, you're not really going to get like an accurate depiction of your students, especially because of the podcast talked about how there's a big like even in these schools you have like a big population of white people and like a very low percentage of like Black, Latino, Asian American. So how is that kind of fair? And I did like about that they also mention how even up to current times, especially with like the pandemic with coronavirus, like you saw more racial discrimination towards Asian Americans because there's this conception that they made the coronavirus, and you get people that are getting attacked, and just that perspective, which is really like a really beautiful aspect to hear, especially because you don't really see as much from it. um
However, they didn't get rid of the tests.
No, the proactive.
Yes, I have friends in New York who at length about how hard everybody studies for these tests to get into the certain high schools. And sometimes they have to go across multiple boroughs to get there and multiple trains. And it's crazy. But if I remembered correctly, in season two, Mayor Bloomberg got rid of the local school boards and it set up a little bit more like CPS, it sounds like. So there aren't community school boards anymore. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, except that they talk about how it reduced population in some of the schools. I don't know if anybody else remembers that.
Yeah, for me, how like the schools were divided, mostly it was like because I grew up in a neighborhood where there was a lot of gangs, right? And there was like the north and the south, so it was like two different gangs. So people weren't able to go to that school. So if you wanted to go to high school, you're gonna get beat up because you're from a different gang. So that's why they were like doing all that to like get the school, another high school in the community.
I think there's a lot of things that I think like I guess like a lot of intersectionality that I think within all of us we kind of see, especially kind of looking at the stuff that we read, like the book on LGBTQ rights, as the movie about like women's rights, and now we kind of have that race, that aspect of it. Um, is there like any common thing that we see? Like I know Tiffany talked about it earlier. You want to talk about that, Tiff? So we can have like a conversation about that. Oh, can hear you.
You're on mute.
Sorry.
Okay.
All right. So for equality and equity, that was one of the common factors that you talked about, Josue, in the text, the doc, and the pod, the LGBTQ youth and education practices, the She's Beautiful When She's Angry, and now the school colors, is that in each of those, all of them are advocating for equality and equity. And then I have this perfect quote to show the difference. Equality means each individual or group of people is given the same resources or opportunities, and equity is recognizing that each person has different circumstances and allocates the exact resources and opportunities needed to reach an equal outcome. And when I thought about that quote, I thought about the intersections of the students, but the intersections of the school, how we have two different schools, but then they're surrounded by a different community. So we have to think about those things. So we can have the same, it could be equal, but we also have to make sure it's equitable for the school, the district, the classroom, and our students. And I think that was a pretty big thing to take in as a teacher, just to make sure, like in my classroom and outside the classroom, that my students are feeling that they have equal opportunity and access
I
for
think
you guys.
I think especially like, like kind of thinking everything that we learned this semester, I mean quarter, I'm so sorry. I think especially like as diverse learner teachers, I think equity is kind of like our best friend, especially because we want to kind of tie it in with like the universal learning of design method, and really making sure, we give that equity education to our students, especially because, we are going to be in schools where we serve underrepresented minorities. This kind of reminded me a lot of like, what was that one class, 507? Where we kind of talked about like our pedagogy and kind of, I think just wrapping everything up, it just kind of goes into that. Is there any other things that kind of stood out to you guys from other classes?
I mean, what I mentioned before we started recording was just looking at the four of us, if we've done all of these projects together, that we each represent one or more marginalized populations. And they're all different. But as we go into the teaching workforce, I'm hopeful that we are a small representation of what we can be or do to make the change and make things more equitable, not necessarily equal. And technically, are things equal? Yeah, we're equally under resourced, but is it equitable? And that we've all been gracious and to each other and been, we're friends, to say we all have that equity piece when we're doing one of these projects. We all have the amount of time, we have the same resources, we have the same information, and we talk about it. That's really what we're hoping for in our schools and for our children and for our communities. And I'm grateful that to have been able to do this with all of you, because hopefully we're just this tiny little sliver of what it should look like across the board.
I think especially which is really cool about like the residency, I think just being able to kind of get exposed to different, I think like just hearing different ways that like every school runs, like where everybody's like a resident at. And it's like, damn, if I was like a teacher, like this is what I want to do now, because you want to make that impact.
Yeah.
Any other like comments, concerns, emotional outbursts? Just kidding about that.
I would recommend that anybody listen to the first couple episodes of each season. It really kind of focuses everything that we've seen or felt or heard this year. It sort of has a pinpoint position of like highlighting certain things, and it just sort of reaffirmed the work that we have to do.
I think also what's really cool about the podcast, just like, kind of recommending it also, is that, they use like this data statistic aspect, but they also use like these real life situations from like parents, organizers, activists, to kind of really paint just a different perspective instead of it just being like very tunnel vision. And I think that's something we could kind of see, especially with like I forgot to definitely mention it, but with the episode 8, it also talked about like, you have that, but you also talk about like the Black Lives Matter movement and how it just all kind of came together, like different minorities kind of working to make sure that we kind of empower each other. Which also kind of goes back into the equity with, we're making sure that all of our students get that equity education we want to give them, whether it's in the north or the south, the east or the west, or anything in between.
Don't
I
go too
also-
far east. End up in the
Um,
winter.
You brought up the children, and I think it's also important, because I believe it was like between season 2 episodes like 1 through 3, and I believe it was called like the Black Jamaican War. I don't want to get it.
Yes, I think I know.
Don't quote me. Yeah, but with all this debate and going back and forth and different views, it had the students having to choose which side and then advocating for themselves and their rights, and just causing a lot of friction. So just important to let children know that they have an equal voice in it all.
Definitely. Any final words, y'all?
I think this sums everything up.
I definitely learned a lot. But thank you, class 5,
Thanks.
for coming to our story time. I hope y'all having a good day. But yeah. All right, guys. Nice chatting.
All right.